So I'm here with Alan Strickland of Volunteering England. Hello.
Hi.
And you've been talking about volunteering in the big society and the opportunities and implications for that. And you started off with kind of the huge shift in the funding landscape for charities and volunteering, and the changes that have meant for charities who use it, volunteers. Do you just want to expand on that?
Well, I think what I was talking about was the real tension between the big society agenda, where there's some really positive messages about volunteering, a real priority on getting people to give their time, give their money. Really great to have that being talked about, in all three sectors, third sector, but also in the public sector and the private sector, which is really positive. But at the same time, what our members are finding, what volunteer involving organisations are finding across the country, is as local authorities pull their budgets back, as primary care trusts pull their budget back, as national government departments change their funding streams, organisations are finding it really difficult to see how they will be able to take advantage of those opportunities that will come through the big society. So I think that's a concern which still needs to be resolved.
Okay. And you were talking about kind of the opportunities that were there, and Volunteering England, it's very much concentrating on the community right to bid to take over local services and local things. So, but you were saying that with that there comes some implications as well as of increased responsibility, of competition possibly with local authority bodies and that sort of thing.
That's right. I mean, we're working sort of across the piece on big society, including the community right to bid and community right to challenge. I think what we're likely to see is obviously a growth in organisations looking to be involved in running those public services, whether it's taking on a service or whether it's taking on the running of a building. But clearly that's going to pose real challenges. Firstly, for small groups who might not be used to all of the governance and infrastructure and all the financial regulations that are involved in running that sort of service. But also, where they get the expertise and the advice from to take on what often will be a much bigger task than they're used to. But also, what groups have been raising with us is, issues around accountability. So if we're involved as a charity in supporting parks in a local authority area, that's one thing. If we were then responsible for the parks, and if things went wrong, we would be, blamed for that, held accountable by the press and the public. Actually, that's a very different position to be in, a very different space to be in. And the feedback we've been getting from organisations is there's real concerns around that. So I think one of the key things government will need to look at is how do you deal with that accountability issue? Who is accountable for those services? And how do you deal with the very real and genuine concerns that lots of charities have got?
And it seems to be a big problem not just in volunteer organisations or bodies taking on those responsibilities, but in people just volunteering their spare time. It's the issue of red tape. So, whether it's getting the right insurance as a body or getting the CRB check as an individual, that's a big problem.
Yeah, we've been really pleased actually that government's put a big emphasis on reducing red tape in volunteering. And we've launched a Cut the Volunteering Out of Red Tape campaign, which has got a couple of elements. Firstly, we're working very closely with government, as you said, on CRB checks and the Independent Safeguarding Authorities to make sure they're streamlined, they're much quicker for people, they can move them from one organisation to another. Working to support volunteer drivers. We were successful in helping to push for the mileage allowance for volunteer drivers to be increased in the budget, which is great, but also dealing with insurance issues. Some insurers charge people more if they're a volunteer driver, which we think is unacceptable. And finally, around benefits, making sure that people who are claiming benefits, who at the end of the day can volunteer, the rules are really clear, making sure that Job Centre Plus advisors do actually know that and do support them. But also, on the other hand, working with the sector to make sure that charities, social enterprises, in the way that they support their volunteers, minimise bureaucracy, are flexible, are dynamic, because we're very aware with things like CRB checks. On the one hand, government needs to cut back on that burden, but equally some charities, CRB check everybody. And so there's a need for better knowledge, really, and for more proportionate sort of regulatory work in the charitable sector as well.
And with a 16-hour week myth, as you call it, I mean, that's a big one, because not only is that a myth amongst job seekers, but amongst workers in job centres. So you're kind of doing an awareness campaign. I think you're going to Birmingham soon as part of a roadshow to increase awareness of busting this myth, basically.
Yeah, so the issue is around the 16-hour rule, so this sort of misperception that you can only volunteer for 16 hours a week if you're claiming benefits like job seekers allowance. So we've been holding a number of meetings, with charities across the country to understand what they think, but also with Job Centre Plus staff, so we can really drill down with them. What's the issue? How can we get better information to you? How can we work in partnership with Job Centre Plus to make sure that when people go into a job centre, they are encouraged to volunteer? That's seen as a really positive thing to get them to work, and that the people giving them that advice do understand what the rules are. The new government scheme, Work Together, which is part of the work programme package, means that there will be a much bigger emphasis on job centres promoting volunteering, and we're really hopeful that will make sure that there's a real push on getting advisors on the front line to understand it. We've been working with Job Centre Plus and the Prince's Trust to try and get what we're calling volunteering desks into job centres. The idea is in a couple of pilot areas there'll actually be a physical presence for the voluntary sector in that job centre. I think that would be a really simple but effective way of bringing Job Centre Plus and the voluntary sector really closely together and making sure there's a much better mutual understanding.
And you've come out with some, Volunteering England is really working to get some resources together, not just for volunteers but for the charities who use them. You work with the NCVO to come up with an amazing website about funding cuts. Do you just want to expand on that?
Yeah, well, it's obviously not really amazing. It's full of information about funding cuts.
Well, no, the cuts aren't amazing, but the resource is amazing.
That's right. I think what we were worried about was, lots of different umbrella groups obviously collecting information about what was happening to their members around the country in terms of funding cuts. Clearly, if we're going to have a strong voice as a voluntary sector, we need one source of information that allows us to work with ministers, work with government nationally and locally, and say, look, this is actually what's happening, this is the picture. And it means that we can obviously target our work much more effectively. So the good thing about the website is incredibly simple to use, really basic form you can put in your details with if you've had your funding reduced in any way. But also incredibly simple to get the information back out. So you can look for all the cuts in a certain region, you can look at all the cuts to youth volunteering, for example. So what we're hoping is both, we can use that nationally to work with government, but also organisations locally can use that to see actually what's happening in my area, what's happened to my fellow youth charities in my area, adult services charities. And so I would really encourage organisations themselves to go in and pull the data out, and make use of that as well.
And the uptake, the reporting of funding cuts has been quite phenomenal. It's apparently the site has seen funding cuts reported about 75 million, is that right?
That's right, so about 75 million cuts from I think about 472 organisations so far. But we know, unfortunately, there are many, many more sort of funding cuts out there, and there'll be more funding cuts during this year. There's obviously a lot of confusion at the moment about what's being cut and what isn't in some areas. And so I'd really strongly encourage organisations, if unfortunately they have had their funding reduced from any source, to upload it to that website, so that we can see what's happening.
And last but not least, but the end part of your presentation, it touched upon job substitution. So basically, organisations or bodies substituting what were paid roles with volunteers, and you've actually worked with a union on this.
We have. So we've had in place for a number of years, and we refreshed this the year before last, a national agreement between us on behalf of the volunteering movement and the TUC on behalf of the trade union movement. And this sets out some really simple and we think helpful principles around how you can build positive relationships between paid staff and volunteers, and obviously as part of that how you can avoid job substitution. Clearly this is a really tricky issue because people are having to let staff go, they're having their funding reduced, but people are still very, very keen, quite rightly, to keep delivering those good services to their beneficiaries and to the communities they're trying to support. So both in the sector but also in the public sector where jobs are going, sometimes there is a tendency to sort of replace staff directly with volunteers. Clearly we'd like to see greater involvement of volunteers. That has to be done properly in consultation with staff, with the potential volunteers, with the unions, because what we don't want to happen is for staff to be sort of directly swapped for volunteers, because it's clear that volunteering should be complementary to the work of paid staff. It brings added value. It can be very difficult to do that substitution. And also what we've seen in areas where this has happened, that volunteers have been seen as being quite politicised, being seen as breaking strikes or being involved in industrial disputes. And obviously that's not a space we want to move volunteering into. So yes, greater involvement of volunteering, but it needs to be thought through carefully and done in careful negotiation with staff and unions.
And you were asked an amazing question at the end, just after the end of the conference, which is, that other kind of suspicion of sometimes where there might be job substitution, which is internships, and what is the difference between an intern and a volunteer?
I think it's such a good question because there's real confusion about, people who might be called an intern. What are they really? Are they an employee? Are they a worker? Are they a volunteer? Or are they something in the middle? So this amorphous intern. So what we've been doing is working with the trade unions and others to try and pin this down really. And so we'll be releasing some advice soon just to try and help people separate this out. Because what we're clear about is there are lots of people who are volunteers, but they, the organisation they work for, volunteer for, calls them an intern. It can be easy to recruit people, it sounds a bit snazzier, all of that sort of stuff. But there is a real lack of clarity around interns, and our concern is that if people don't recognise that some of their interns are volunteers, they won't be using, volunteering good practice and accepted support. But equally, if some of those interns are actually employees, even bigger problems there, with people clearly not being paid the right wage, not being given access to the right workers' rights. So I think this issue really needs to be resolved, and we hope that our advice, which will be more on obviously on the volunteering side, where interns are actually volunteers, we hope that would be really helpful. But I would really encourage organisations, if they're looking to have interns or they've got them already, to really make sure they spend some time thinking through, is this person a volunteer, are they a worker, are they an employee? And as a result of that, are we treating them properly, are we supporting them properly?
So you're touching on the issue of rights here, which again is something volunteers suffer for, not really having the same rights perhaps as an employee, and you're kind of working towards ensuring that they do have some rights, and some come back when things don't work out.
Well, we've over the last sort of 18 months had what we call the Volunteer Rights Inquiry, which has been really interesting in looking at cases where volunteers have felt mistreated, or things haven't gone quite to plan, and they felt they should have had rights or access to rights. What we're clear though about is that we don't want to make things really bureaucratic. We don't advocate at the moment a wholesale transfer of employees' rights to volunteer, because the nature of volunteering is very, very different. What we're advocating is that organisations put in place the correct processes and procedures, so that A, everybody knows how their volunteers should be supported, B, they're really clear if something goes wrong, if there's a dispute, if you get a complaint about one of your volunteers, you know what to do. And thirdly, there's in place a really clear process for reconciliation. So if there is an issue, there is a dispute, there's a process for resolving that, because that again was a problem we saw in the inquiry. Lots of organisations not really knowing what to do when there's a dispute about a volunteer. So I think it's about organisations getting their processes right, rather than necessarily bringing in lots of bureaucratic sort of new rights and responsibilities.
Okay, well that's great. Well, thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.